I'm surprised to realize I don't think I've ever made a video talking specifically about the big three in concept, my memory of how this all developed. I became interested in it because there is a new Lextorius video that goes over sort of understanding how did this phrase materialize, when did it come from, why did it come from, and it kind of seems like no one really knows. So I'm going to give my perspective on it as somebody who has been a fan throughout this whole period, of manga and anime, somebody who was reading Shonen Jump before the phrase Big Three arrived into the lexicon, at least in the English-speaking fandom. I'm going to try to make sense of how I think it came about, as well as just my perspective on whether I think it's a term that is still useful today. I think it's more interesting as a historical artifact of how Westerners talk about manga from the 2000s than it is really like anything that like was specifically meaningful outside of that context. Even if we're just talking about being bestseller, like I think Lextorius does a great job of breaking down all the reasons it doesn't make sense to consider the big three as anything other than what I'm going to pitch. But I'm basically saying here's how it can still be thought of as like meaningful as a place and time thing. But I also want to declare what I think are the real big three of shonen manga, which I guess they're already on screen, but I'll offer the logic. When I first got into manga and anime, it was not popular. It was not something, those weren't words that people knew. Like, there were specific anime that were popular, such as Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Pokemon, but nobody called them anime, nobody thought of them that way. And that included myself. I got into anime separately from the fact that those shows existed on TV. Now, when Adult Swim started up an anime-specific block in 2001, that's when the word anime entered my lexicon, and particularly because the Anime Invasion magazine started at that time as well. So I had like two avenues to view this thing through, and both of them presented it as a collection of work within a style that was mostly unified by the fact that it comes from Japan, and that like a lot of the same people kind of work on these shows, although that's the kind of thing I wouldn't understand until way later, like how small the anime industry really is. But from the beginning, for me, I understood anime to mean this thing that includes Cowboy Bebop and Mobile Suit Gundam and Macross and the Star Blazers, that goes back to the 60s. Reading the early Anime Invasion magazines, they pretty much told the story in brief as much as they could of how anime culture in the West had reached this point. The magazines that were coming out were telling the stories of the magazines that had been out, telling you what was popular in the 80s. Like, that Robotech was this mega franchise, but it was it was like a remade version of this thing called Macross, and like all that's explained in the first issue of Anime Invasion. So it's kind of like a collection of anime analysis videos, but there wasn't a huge audience, especially of young people, for this magazine. And it wasn't really until 2003 that I remember anime and manga blowing up to a much larger scale than where they had been up to that point. A huge part of this that doesn't get talked about enough is Yu-Gi-Oh! I think so many people kind of regard Yu-Gi-Oh! In the shadow of Pokemon and other like collectible, card-driven franchises that they don't realize it was almost as popular as Pokemon. Like, it reached that level of cultural zenith. It's just that didn't seem shocking anymore, because we had the precedent of Pokemon. But in terms of how many people were engaging with Yu-Gi-Oh!, that was a big part of bringing anime even more to the forefront, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is obviously anime. You got the big hair, the ridiculous voices and everything, and everybody went, oh, this is like Dragon Ball Z and Pokemon. It's like, oh, wait, there's a bridge between all of this. And so when the monthly Shonen Jump manga started publishing in the US, that was mostly on the strength of the fact that they could run OG Yu-Gi-Oh! They could run the chapters that had been adapted to anime, but those episodes never ran in the US. And so a big part, much like how Anime Invasion started off like telling you what had been censored from Dragon Ball in their like the cover story of their first issue, the Shonen Jump magazine got to launch with, we are showing you the dark side of Yu-Gi-Oh! We're showing you the real shit. And basically using the fact that the American publishing market lets you get away with just infinitely more than what the broadcasting side of the country will let you get away with. I think the assumption is just that if you're a kid who can like read or like seeks reading, then you must be like mature enough to handle the content of books. I don't know. But it's hilarious in the United States, like how tremendously different the standards are for print media versus televised media. So when Shonen Jump started publishing, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball Z were both in it. That propelled the popularity of the magazine a lot. But what made me a fan of it was reading what I considered to be the big three of the magazine: Naruto, One Piece, and Shaman King. Not in that order either. One Piece was my least favorite of the three. And it really was mostly, I think, the stylization and subject matter. I wasn't as interested in pirates. I wasn't as interested in the loud, cartoony look of that series as I was in the edgier, sleeker style of Naruto, or the really just like cool, laid back artwork of Shaman King is really gorgeous. I think of those three, Hiroyuki Takei's art holds up the best, especially from the early work of the manga. So those were my Shaman King and Naruto were easily my favorites in that early period of monthly Shonen Jump. But Shaman King was actually the, I think, first one whose anime adaptation made it to TV. And at the time, there were multiple anime blocks on television because in front of Adult Swim, Cartoon Network had added another anime block that was just like a bunch of action shows, which was tremendously awesome. That's where Rurouni Kenshin and G Gundam first started airing before they moved those to Toonami. And then you had like the Fox box, which was like Kirby and fighting Foodons and like a lot of very kid-oriented stuff. And Shaman King ran there, and the dub was just like, it was very censored. It was very just off character to me. You know, it didn't feel like the manga. And also, the artwork of that anime is fine, but not consistent. And it just felt like really slow compared to the manga. So I think this is where I first started discovering like manga purism. Like for a while, I really felt like some of my favorite manga had kind of been ruined for me because the anime, because I wanted them to have awesome anime adaptations, and then when that wasn't the case, it like made me kind of disillusioned me to the idea that it's always a good thing to get the anime version of your favorite manga. And like when Naruto started up on Adult Swim in 2004, like it came out at a time, I think it started when I didn't have cable, so I was also kind of like already playing catch up with it, but only by a couple episodes when I actually like got cable again and was able to watch it. But I remember immediately just being so put off by the dub, by the Believe It, because that just the English Shonen Jump manga had not chosen to handle the Datebayo thing at all. They had just not addressed it, you know? So in the anime, it felt like this strange addition to the character that had just not been there at all in the manga version to me. I don't know. It put me off right away. I like immediately was not interested in the Naruto anime. And at that point, I was also like way into Full Metal Alchemist. You know, I was a few years older. You know, I was kind of moved on from Naruto. Like even as a fan of the manga, I'd kind of moved on. It had gotten into the Chunin arc, and I didn't really care about all the new characters that got dumped on us all at once. So I kind of like lost interest in Naruto, and I was probably FMA and like Trigun were like my favorite anime around this time. And this is also when the Bleach manga started running in the US, but funnily enough, Bleach wasn't even in the American Shonen Jump. It was published just as individual volumes, and it was advertised heavily in Shonen Jump. But I think that probably just because to me, Bleach felt like immediately older. Like There's just, I guess, more of a demographic difference in the U.S. maybe, or maybe it's just because of the fact that in Japan, Weekly Shonen Jump is a massive magazine. You know, it's got tons of stuff. So like some of it can be for older teens, some of it can be for younger teens. But like the United States version of Monthly Shonen Jump was very much aimed at like 13 to 15-year-olds, with I think Dragon Ball being like the oldest feeling manga in there, and or like the one that felt the most for adulter, slightly more grown audiences. Yu Yu Hakusho also felt like a little bit more grown just because of the artwork than the other stuff in the magazine at the time, and both of those were a little bit older, so you know they kind of predated the total saturation of Dragon Ball influence that came in the late 90s. So Bleach had this vibe of being like for older teens, and eventually that anime hit Adult Swim. Now, to me, the point where Naruto and Bleach were running together on Adult Swim, this marks a moment where anime fandom kind of became what it now is. Before that point, anime was invading, but it wasn't like it wasn't culturally there yet. Like, again, people didn't know the word anime. The word anime entered English parlance on a commonplace level when Naruto and Bleach were both running at the same time, because they had so many joined fans. So many people went, and I think it was probably Naruto that was overall bigger, but like people would watch Naruto and then someone would put them onto Bleach. You know, like inevitably that's your next step up, because it is for, you know, slightly older. It's like, okay, you had fun with that, but now you get to see like the, you know, the little bit more grown up version. And over time, I would meet so many people in high school who had read Naruto, but they always had like the same opinion, which is that it's not really that good. I just read it for Hinata, you know, or whatever. And then with Bleach, it was always like, oh, I'm in love with Rukia. The Soul Society arc is amazing. You know, nobody really cared that much about post-Soul Society Bleach. And again, people were literally just reading Naruto to see what was going to happen. If Hinata and Naruto were going to be happy in the end. And so that's why Boruto gets to exist, is that like being the child of Naruto and Hinata is like being like the child of Romeo and Juliet if they actually got to fuck, you know, like it leaves the entire thing with no real purpose, but it allows the IP to continue. If Naruto and Bleach were really like the big two, why did it become the big three? I think the reason for that is just simply that by this point in Japan, One Piece was the uncontested champion. It was the biggest manga. And it had the most popular anime. It had movies coming out all the time. And if you knew like hardcore anime fans, they tended to be hugely into One Piece, because at this point it was like 500, 600 episodes already. You know, it had been running since the like 97 or something like that, 98. I believe it's the oldest of the three. And I don't think it had had as much filler as Naruto very infamously had in its run. The One Piece fans would not stop singing the praises of One Piece, but One Piece had a really hard time catching on because A, the original dub treated it like a kid's show, and people really didn't like it. It also wasn't really pushed initially. Like, One Piece started growing in this era because they started running it on Cartoon Network late at night, closer to, you know, when Naruto and Bleach would come on. So I think that more young kids like my brother Shade, who was like the age where, you know, he would leave Cartoon Network on all night. So this is how I like saw these. This is why I know all this, is that Cartoon Network is just always playing in my house growing up. But like, if you ask the average high schooler about it, they'd always be like, oh yeah, I tried One Piece, but like it's too goofy, or it's too, you know, I don't like the art style, or I don't care about pirates. Those are like the three things I would always hear. And so it was mostly online that I would see the big three postured as like this conversation, and mostly on 4chan, mostly on the anime and manga board. There was always a big three discussion going on. So if you, at any point in this period of the internet where 4chan was pretty popular, it was probably one of the best known word of mouth websites. One of the ones that if you knew the internet, people asked you if you knew 4chan. And by far the most people who used 4chan just used the random board, which was just like gore and child pornography and weird shit, like not a place to go. Anytime somebody told me they used B, I'd be like, oh, like, uh-oh. But the anime and manga board was also one of the biggest anime and manga discussion communities and one of the deepest, where you could always find people who knew everything, but it was also the saltiest, most vicious anime and manga community on the internet. And there was always, always, always debate going on about the big three, because there was always the One Piece fans arguing that it's the actual best, it's the one with the numbers, it's got the best story. Most people who don't like it haven't read it. That was always the big contention, or haven't seen it. Most people who don't like One Piece simply haven't taken the time to let its gears turn. Whereas Naruto and Bleach, the appeal is immediately evident, but they both have a lot to apologize for, So there was always raging arguments about these three. Eventually, I think that helped to get One Piece into more people's view, because it was always like, well, what is this thing that's supposed to be, better than Naruto and Bleach? And eventually, Funimation finally redubbed the show. That was a huge part of getting One Piece firmly into the big three conversation in the West, because it caused all the One Piece fans to re-recommend it, to insist, tell the story of why the other dub was bad and this dub is good. And it's like, the art style was probably the main thing that put most people off, but it's just not something that appeals to Western sensibilities in the same way, because it lacks that little bit of edge. There's a reason that Kirby always has angry eyes and a sword on the cover of North American versions of Kirby games. There's also the fact that Naruto and Bleach did just kind of keep going downhill in popular consensus, while One Piece has kind of only ever gotten more beloved by its fans. The One Piece movies were always a lot better than the Naruto and Bleach movies. Shippuden was its whole own thing. A lot of people don't even really like any of Shippuden, and that shit's twice the length of the original show. Now, I'm going to propose that based on the timeline I've just identified, where I think the big three came into this is pretty much from the fact that black people got really into manga in 2005. If you don't know, the big three is pretty much mostly associated with basketball as a phrase that is used to describe three really great players. I almost said giants, but everybody in basketball is extremely tall. The most big three discourse in culture transpired in basketball. Which, look, I'm not saying that there weren't lots of white people also talking about who the big three were in basketball, but what I am saying is that in the early 2000s, all the kids who I saw at school who had Shonen Jump magazine besides myself were black kids who were drawing those characters, in their notebooks. And when the internet was really blowing up, a lot of that culture was about white people culture and black people culture and world culture all intermingling to become a new United States millennial culture. I have certainly heard more black arguments about the big three in anime and manga than I have from white people. Not to say that white people don't care about it. They definitely do. But I'm just saying, I don't think white people came up with the big three of anime and manga. I don't think Japanese people came up with it either, based on what Lextorius said in his video. I think that when black people caught on to anime and manga, they brought the basketball big three conversation into the anime and manga conversation. Why is big three so popular with black people? I think because of appreciation of the Holy Trinity and spirituality. Black communities are the only place that people still pay attention to what the Bible actually says and care about modern pop culture at the same time. It's the only culture in America where Christianity doesn't exclude your ability to normal shit. So I think it really comes down to the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and that's why we're so drawn to it. We're looking for those holy trinities in different things. And now that Big Three has entered the modern lexicon, I think probably talk about the big three of basketball players was probably bigger than talk of the big three of anime and manga was in its time, because it's more of a mainstream subject matter. I think that the fact that Big Three reemerged into a different medium, like the fact that that conversation became something we're talking about over here in anime and manga, is what then germinated it to have to expand and spiral outward from there. Because I never heard anybody talk about Big Three in any musical category, notwithstanding rap. There was never a who are the big three about music until the 2010s, when people started trying to make the big three out of Drake, J. Cole, and Kendrick Lamar. Now, I think the reason that this big three conversation, this took a really long time to like metabolize into something anybody took seriously. Because first of all, none of the old heads are going to respect any of these guys until they're 10 years into their careers. Well, guess what? We're past that now. And all three of them have like defining cultural works. They have reasons they've been in this conversation. And like there were times where I felt like this conversation's kind of ridiculous, because if you are of the opinion that like Drake is in it because he's the best seller and Kendrick's in it because he is the best rapper, why is J. Cole also in the conversation? And it kind of feels like it's because J. Cole fans used to be very insistent that he is as conscious as Kendrick is. And the reality is that J. Cole did a better job than Drake of bringing something that is conscious to a huge number of people. I don't think Drake is necessarily an unconscious rapper. I think that he is consciously wrong. I think that he is consciously not great of a person. And so when we read Drake, we're reading him as like kind of a representative scumbag, a representative fuckboy. He's popular because he speaks to the fuckboy in everybody, especially fuckboys, in whom there is a lot of that. You know, bitch with him and a bitch in him, that's a lot of bitch, as Kendrick would say. And then you got J. Cole, who's like trying to be a good man. Like that's the theme of his music. But he's doing it at like a lower intellectual level that everybody can relate to, which means he's not really saying stuff that's nearly as deep as someone like Kendrick, who's really writing this crazy shit that has to be decoded by culture. But like that wasn't tremendously valued broadly, you know, it just wasn't. And we kind of look to the numbers as like the representative statistics. I think in a way people are giving Kendrick the numbers out of the respect for what he's done. Like people have finally decided, yes, we do want to listen to a song to decode the lyrics, to analyze it. We are listening to music that requires analysis, because we know that when we do that analysis, not only will our relationship with the music be better, our relationship with ourselves will be better if the music's really that good. You know, Drake music never did nothing for you, never made you a better person, never made you feel better about yourself. Kendrick music made you love yourself. So you want to investigate why that is, get deeper into it. So I think that Kendrick has always been changing the culture by proving himself right and proving his methodology right. And it's what has eventually led to him being number one, very similarly to One Piece. Very similar to the way that One Piece, as a story, it might have taken a few turns that not everybody loves, but overall, the fans hold it down because they see the vision and they see that the manga continues to follow the original vision and continues to make good on the prophecies that it was setting up from the start. Whereas Naruto and Bleach lost their way, you know, and they're still kind of hanging around, and they still have their fan bases, and there's still lots of love, and they'll always be remembered as legends. But there is no context where they get to be part of a big three conversation anymore. That was a time and place thing. The time and place when Kendrick, J. Cole, and Drake were sincerely people that could be thought of as a big three. So part of the reason I made this video is I already talked about the fact that there was a new video from Lextorius. There's also a new video from Anthony Aiken Jr. called The Rise and Fall The rise and fallout of the big three, a deep dive into Kendrick Lamar, Drake, and J. Cole. The fact that these two videos came out on the same day and have nothing to do with one another is what drove me to have to make a video comparing all of this. In that video, he breaks down the whole history of how these three came together and broke apart. And there's a period in 2013 where it made sense to consider them as the big three because of the fact that they were essentially working together to be collectively the biggest thing in hip-hop, together. And that's kind of important to how the whole big three conversation in manga and in basketball happened, because typically you were describing three people on the same team. Three people who made a team so good that that team became the champion team. Three manga that made Shonen Jump outsell every other manga magazine in the height of its run. Well, the second height of its run after the original Dragon Ball height. And so if we're looking at it like Drake, Kendrick, and J. Cole are the big three because they are a team, then that would have made sense. But that team immediately broke apart. And this video kind of details that, like, 2014, there's like a dark moment, and then it seems like nobody's doing the same thing anymore. I think that's a really fascinating, I want to know more about 2014 and what happened there. It's like a big mystery left by this video. But this video describes the fallout of these three like a tragic shonen manga arc. It feels like you're reading about how Naruto and Sasuke became friends through friendly competition, and then Sasuke did genocide and they could never be friends again, really. And we haven't gotten to Aubrey's sorry moment, his little what is it, yeah, my bad, or whatever Sasuke says at the end. Realistically though, if we're talking about the conversation of who are the greatest rappers of all time, and we're trying to pick three rappers, Kendrick Lamar is allowed in that conversation. And even then, the more I've learned about hip-hop history, the more I want there to be, I want to be able to say, like, Kendrick can't be in that top three because there's so many people who've put out so much good stuff for even longer. It's just that I know Kendrick will do, like, no matter what he does, it's gonna be fucking great, and he's already done so much, and it's at such a high level. Like, I cannot name another rapper who has been at the height he's at the consistency he's been at that height. It's just not tenable. It was incomparable last year. And everybody put out music last year. So yeah, if there is really a top three rappers of all time, Kendrick belongs in that. But that was never what the big three was about. The point of Kendrick's been talking about top fives forever, because everybody talks about your top five rappers. That's the conversation. It's never been top three. When J. Cole said he thought that the big three was him, Drake, and Kendrick, I don't think he was necessarily trying to say we are the top three rappers of all time. He means that the competition between the three of us is the top of the game. And Kendrick looked at that like, nah, that ship has sailed a long time. If that was true, I would have been on the song with y'all. How is it a competition between the three of us and two of you are on one song talking about me? Fuck a big three, it's just big me. I've lapped y'all. And he'd lapped them a bunch of times. If there's a version of Drake that could have been in the GOAT conversation, it would have been a guy that stuck with Kendrick from 2013 till now. We would have been talking about him as like Kendrick's number two guy. The guy who, in the way that people will say like Royce da 5'9" would be in the GOAT conversation if he wasn't like strictly working with Eminem all the time, who people put in the GOAT conversation because he's got the hits and everything. But like, like that would be Drake for Kendrick at this point. But Kendrick doesn't have that. Kendrick doesn't have a second guy. His second guy and his third guy, were too busy doing their own fucking thing. Too busy stroking their own egos to sublimate to the fact that he was clearly the GOAT. when Snoop Dogg told Kendrick, "You are the guy," they should have gone, "All right, I guess we're in your crew now. I guess we are Kendrick's backup. I guess Kendrick's going to ghostwrite all our bars so that all of us will have better bars. But it wasn't like that. So, yeah, there was no big three. Does Kendrick belong in the top 3 rappers conversation or the top 5 rappers conversation? Absolutely. Who else do I think would be in that conversation? I mean, I'm a huge Ghostface Killah fan. I think LL Cool J belongs in there, but even then, that's 2 just from New York, and New York created hip-hop. KRS-One, still always kills everything he does. I mean, and I'm stuck on one city. What if I leap down to, a lot of people try to put Lil Wayne in the GOAT conversation. I've never really even listened to him like that, so I can't say, but I know he's got crazy bars. But, when you start really opening up this conversation, there's no way you can justify picking 3. Everybody should just stick to having their personal top 5, and let's not try to talk about who are the top 5 rappers, because if we're going to get into the justifications, there's just too much nuance. It can't happen. Big 3 made sense as a time and place thing, but J. Cole trying to force that meme back into culture has backfired tremendously on his ass. And same goes with manga. There was a period where people were trying to say the new big 3 from Shonen Jump, after Bleach and Naruto had ended, there was a period where Haikyuu and Boku no Hero Academia were the biggest manga in Jump. But they were kind of, it's like those 2 in One Piece. Well, they're not in the same generation. It doesn't have the same. It can't just be what are the 3 biggest manga in Jump, and for the most part, those series had nothing the fuck to do with one another. It wasn't as though Haikyuu fans were then jumping right over to watch. They could jump right over to watch whatever the fuck they want. There's so much more anime now, the conversation about anime since the 2010s has just been totally different. It's no longer 3 tentpole series carrying everything. It's a Netflix tab, It's a whole fucking culture that everybody understands. So the concept of a big 3 in that sense has evaporated. Now, if we were going to talk about the 3 most definitional shonen manga of all time, up to now, we'll say, I would go Astro Boy, Dragon Ball Z, One Piece. Because it's a 1, 2, 3 of influence. It's Astro Boy was the first mega popular shonen manga. Akira Toriyama grew up with it, basically ripped it off and did a different art style that was more transcendent, reached more people, was able, right as Tezuka was passing, he was able to become the torchbearer. And then Eiichiro Oda, Dragon Ball finally ended, One Piece launches, directly influenced by everything Dragon Ball did, takes it to another place, takes it to an even, maybe not as much of a transcendental art style, but more transcendental storytelling. He took that and said, what if we took what Dragon Ball does as a story and make that work better? That allowed One Piece to become this big thing. And maybe there will be another successor, but I think until we see how One Piece ends, it will be hard to formally declare anything as a follow-up, to that. And I don't know if there could be, now what intrigues us is not more of that. We've got stuff like Jujutsu Kaisen that takes a totally different approach to long-form storytelling and is massively popular. And I think when we see the influence of that, we're going to be talking about a whole new big 3, We're going to be talking about Jujutsu Kaisen and the next unfathomably popular thing that was directly influenced by that, and so on and so forth. So, again, when you reach a point where you've gotten past the germination stage of this medium, the conversation gets so much harder to have. I'm sure there was a point where, 50 years into film, there was lots of debate over, I don't remember how old Casablanca really is. I was going to say, is it Casablanca, The Sound of Music, or fucking Wizard of Oz, or whatever the fuck are the popular movies from back then, were people debating, what are the big 3 most popular movies? I really doubt anybody gave a fuck back then. They were worried about cholera or whatever. Anyways, I think the next time that the phrase big 3 will be relevant It will be when a new medium or style emerges that is popularized by three competing but ultimately working together brands that are all operating at such a high level that they create this new thing. Like right now in independent animation, right? Like Glitch is the clear forerunner where like that studio is like reaching a level of popularity that independent animation just simply hasn't ever achieved. Now, let's say that some of the stuff they work with, like Lackadaisy, which I consider to be the best like independent animation of that caliber and sphere, and like Hell of a Boss. Like, let's say that through all of these things working together, they brought about like a new age, and they just kept batting it out of the park for a decade. And eventually, we're like, those are the big three independent animation. At some point, there would be a moving on from it, but that would be like an example of something I could imagine bringing Big Three back to be relevant. But I think if we keep talking about Big Three, like there should always be a Big Three, like just all contexts at any given time, whatever are the top three things are the Big Three, that is the wrong way to look at it. The Big Three is a team effort of three amazing things that have lifted the entire medium. That's why I feel more comfortable with the Astro Boy, Dragon Ball, One Piece things. Even though they're not all three Shonen Jump manga, there is a sense of deliberate torch carrying. I could even say with like rappers, it would be like Tupac giving it to Kendrick, and then we might not know who number 3 is in that line yet, because I don't think there's been a third rapper. Tupac and Kendrick are probably the two most tremendous influences on hip hop in terms of like reaching a global zeitgeist. So like I don't think we've even met the number 3 in a generational big 3 of rappers. Anyways, that's enough about the big 3. I'm glad that I was inspired to get my thoughts out there, and if you haven't already seen those Anthony Aiken Jr. video and Lextorious videos, I highly recommend them. They're linked down below. My links are all down below as well. Make me president in 2028. I'm Trixie the Golden Witch, signing out and reminding you to never forget anime forever.